President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Maine.
Mr. President, this bill is a farce. Imagine a bunch of guys sitting around a table and saying, I've got a great idea. Let's give $32,000 worth of a tax break to a millionaire, and we'll pay for it by taking health insurance away from lower income and middle income people. And to top it off, how about we cut food stamps, we cut SNAP, we cut food aid to people. It's a joke. I would say it was a joke, except it's not the least bit funny. I've been in this business of public policy now for 20 years, 8 years as governor, 12 years in the United States Senate. I have never seen a bill this bad. I have never seen a bill that is this irresponsible, regressive, and downright cruel. The basic premise of the bill, as I said, is cut benefits for the American people, particularly in the areas of health care and food, in exchange for tax cuts for the very wealthy. Now, I know my colleagues are going to come to the floor because I've had this discussion before. They're going to say, oh, no, this is a middle-class tax cut. This is going to cut taxes for people in the middle class. Well, here's a little suggestion of how to get out of this mess. If you cap the tax cuts at people making $400,000 a year, which is a pretty healthy income, the cost of this bill would drop by 60%. And you wouldn't have any need to cut Medicaid. And by the way, there are Medicare cuts also built into this, and SNAP. $400,000. In other words, we're for the middle-class tax cuts. That's okay. But just stop it at $400,000 and don't give the tax breaks to the people. A millionaire under this bill gets a $32,000 tax cut. A person making $5 or $10 million gets a couple of $100,000 tax cut. I don't think they need it. They sure as hell don't need it as much as people need health insurance. So just to put a fine point on it, this bill is literally, and remember my $400,000 suggestion, so we're taking care of the middle class, but with 60% of the cost above $400,000 in income, this bill is literally taking food out of the mouths of kids to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax break. That's the facts. They're ugly. And like I say, if we were talking about this in random, sitting around at a lunch table, people would say, well, that's a joke, that's ridiculous. Nobody would suggest that. But here we are. And several of my colleagues, including Senator Tillis from North Carolina, have pointed out there's no rush on this bill. We don't have to do this bill by July 4th or July 10th. There's no rush. These tax credits, these tax cuts don't expire until the end of the year. Let's take our time and write a decent bill. Let's kill this bill. It'll only take 4 or 5 senators on the other side. We can kill this thing and start over and write a decent bill on a bipartisan basis. And I think we'd find agreement on middle-class tax cuts. But I think we could also do some things with expenditures that wouldn't be so bloody harmful. Medicaid. Let me start with hospitals. In Maine, I've talked to the hospitals, I've talked to the Hospital Association, I've talked to small hospitals, large hospitals. They're mostly running on a 1%, 2%, or 3% margin. The analysis is that this could cost us 2 to 5 of our rural hospitals. And when a rural hospital goes out, several things happen. One thing is the economy of the town goes with it. In most of these small towns, the hospital is the major employer. So you're talking about the economics of those jobs in a small town that will make a huge difference in that local economy. The second thing that happens is a loss of services for everybody in town, not just the Medicaid people. That hospital closes, everybody in town is going to have to drive another 30, 40, 50, 100 miles to get care. And they're going to have to not only, there may be closures, there will certainly be cutting of services. We already have a serious problem in Maine of obstetric services. We've got a county with no obstetric services. And that's only going to get worse under this bill. The hospitals are pleading with us to not do this. And again, do we really need to do this to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax break? It doesn't make any sense. Now, I've talked about hospitals, but let's talk about people. The analysis is 60,000 people in Maine would lose their insurance coverage. 40,000 under Medicaid, about 20,000 under the Affordable Care Act. And we've had a lot of personal stories tonight. I want to tell a story about myself. When I worked here in the 70s, I had insurance. It was employer-supported insurance. We paid part of the premium. I had insurance as a junior staff member in this body 50 years ago. Because I had that insurance that covered a free checkup, I went in and had my first physical in 8 years. And I wouldn't have had that physical if the insurance hadn't have covered it. I wouldn't have been able to spring for it. I had that physical, and the doctors found a little mole on my back. And they took it out. And I didn't think much of it. And I went in a week later, and the doctor said, "You better sit down, Angus. That was malignant melanoma. You're going to have serious surgery." And a friend of mine who was a doctor said, "Angus, here's my best advice. Let them be as radical as they want in that surgery." And I had the surgery, and here I am. If I hadn't had insurance, I wouldn't be here. And it's always haunted me that some young man in America that same year had malignant melanoma. He didn't have coverage, he didn't have insurance, he didn't get that checkup, and he died. That's wrong, that's immoral. So the idea of cutting health insurance from people is just, oh, well, they just won't have coverage for their doctor's visits. No, people die when they don't have health insurance. There is statistical analysis to bear that out. So this isn't any joke. And by the way, people say, well, we're talking about fraud in Medicaid. Listen, almost $1 trillion cut in Medicaid, 15 million people being cut off, 60,000, 40,000 in the state of Maine, that isn't fraud. That's cutting people who need the care. And I don't understand the obsession, and I never had. And I stood right there and watched John McCain cast that vote to save the Affordable Care Act, along with my colleague Susan Collins. I don't understand this obsession with taking health insurance away from people. I don't get it. Trying to take away the Affordable Care Act in 2017 or 2018, and now this? What's driving this? What's the cruelty to do this, to take health insurance away from people, knowing that it's going to cost them? It's hard to calculate the cost, up to and including losing their lives. Okay, let's talk about SNAP. Let's talk about SNAP. The average benefit for SNAP is $6 a day. You feed yourself on $6 a day. The average cost of a meal in the U.S. is about $10.50 a day. So we're already below cost, if you will. And here's what it means in my state. 20% of the children in my state are food insecure. And we're talking about cutting SNAP and taking dollars away from those kids. And I was interested in that, and I thought, oh, that's pretty bad. I'm worried Maine's 20%. 20% of our kids are food insecure. So I did a little research. In Arkansas, it's 24% of the kids who are food insecure. In Iowa, 17%. South Carolina, 14%. Michigan, 19%. Missouri, another 19%. That's 1 out of 5 kids are food insecure, and we're going to cut that food in order to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax cut. Mr. President, that's not only bad policy, it's downright immoral. Okay, what's the other problem with this bill? There's so many, and so many problems, so little time. It's irresponsible. It adds about $4 trillion to the deficit. And by the way, this current policy thing doesn't pass a straight face test. A 7th grader knows it's nonsense. You got to borrow the money to pay. If this bill doesn't pass, then there isn't a $4 trillion hit on the budget. If it passes, there is. And the thing that really gives a lie to this nonsense is also in this bill is a $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. If it's not really debt, then we don't need to increase the debt ceiling. It's a sham. Voodoo budgeting. So, I don't want to hear any more from my colleagues about deficits. I don't want to hear any more crocodile tears about deficits. We're mortgaging our future. I hear all this drama about deficits from people who are voting for this bill to add $4 trillion to the deficit unnecessarily. There's a saying of a famous New Englander, your actions speak so loud I can't hear your words. Your actions speak so loud I can't hear your words. Your actions are, you're adding to the deficit unnecessarily. So don't talk to me about deficits. Now, the first rule, if you're in a hole, is stop digging. And we're in a hole, Mr. President. We're in a hole, so you stop digging by not passing this bill or not passing it in the extreme form that it is to give the tax benefits, 60% of the tax benefits to people making over $400,000 a year. The reason, what's driven the deficit, if you go back and look over the last 20 years, there are three things. One were the unpaid for Bush tax cuts. We had major tax cuts and then a war that we put on the credit card. The unpaid for Trump tax cuts in 2017 and COVID. Now, COVID was an emergency. And the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 and 10, that were emergencies. That's where you run deficits. But you don't run deficits when times are good, and that's exactly what we're doing here. If you're in a hole, stop digging. And by the way, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan group, has said, and I haven't heard this mentioned, this bill will actually accelerate the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. There's a nice thing for you. It'll make those funds go insolvent sooner than would otherwise be the case. Gutting the IRS. By the way, I have another suggestion for my colleagues. You want to find $600 billion a year? Enforce the tax laws against cheaters. That's the estimate. $600 billion a year is left on the table because cheaters, mostly high income, are not paying the taxes they owe. The poor stiff that gets a 1040, he has to pay it. Everybody knows what he's making. But it's these people with the fancy lawyers and accountants, and I'm not talking about tax avoidance here. I'm talking about stone-cold tax evasion. $600 billion a year. That would be nice instead of cutting Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps. Another piece of this bill that hasn't got much attention is ICE. The current budget of ICE is $9 billion a year. Under this, they're increasing it $75 billion over 4 years. That's an additional $18 billion a year. They're tripling the budget of ICE. They're tripling the budget. We're dangerously close, Mr. President, to creating a federal police force, which we've never had in this country and we shouldn't have. And by the way, I have never in my life seen a law enforcement officer with a mask on. I don't get where that came from. A law enforcement officer wearing a mask. Where I come from, people that wear masks are not the good guys. And I don't understand that, but to triple this budget, you wonder where that's going to take this country. So let me go back to the beginning. All this damage to give a tax break to a guy who's making $1 million. The chairman of the Finance Committee wasn't here, I think, when I said this. Mr. Chairman, if we limit the tax cuts to people making $400,000 and less, it will reduce the cost of this bill by 60%. It will ameliorate the need for any cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. It would also minimize the hit on the debt and the deficit. There is no rush to pass this bill. Let's kill it, give it a merciful death over the next 24 hours, and then start over writing a responsible bill to deal with the expiring tax cuts for the middle class and deal with issues within the federal government that should be addressed. But this bill is not the answer. It is a sham. And it is a shame and it is embarrassing to even be debating this bill. It should have never come before us in this form. I hope that enough of my colleagues will see that this is an unnecessary damage to the citizens of this country and the citizens of their state. Every state's citizens are going to suffer. And this is something that we in this body can and should prevent. Mr. President, I yield the floor.